We were inspecting the place. Freed prisoners drove up with wagon loads of corpses removed from the compound proper. Watching the unloading was horrible. The bodies squished and gurgled as they hit the pile, and the odour could almost be seen. Beneath the furnaces was the execution chamber, a windowless cell, 20 feet square, with gas nozzles every few feet across the ceiling. Outside, in addition, a huge mound of charred bone fragments were the carefully sorted and stacked clothes of the victims, which obviously numbered in the thousands. Although I stood there looking at it, I couldn't believe it. Those were the words of an American soldier who liberated Dachau concentration camp. Inside of the concentration camps there was death and horror around every corner, and the sights that greeted the inmates would stay with the liberators until the day they died. But inside of Dachau and other camps, there was a significant amount of reprisal against the former guards and prisoner functionaries who worked keeping them in terrible conditions. There was a huge amount of vengeance killing in the camps following liberation, and the liberators at times turned a blind eye to it. Today we look at why the concentration camp prisoners beat guards to death. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It might be in the views of many a simple and straightforward question to answer. However, I would suggest that understanding how the inmates felt inside the concentration camps would be impossible to put into words. Many had been locked up for years in different sites, and they were terrorised on a daily basis, forced to witness public executions, their friends and fellow inmates being hanged on a gallows in front of their eyes. They lived with the constant fear of being sent to the gas chambers or being shot or hanged, and each day they woke up not knowing if their day was their last. It would have been an awful and harrowing existence, and they knew that the SS guards would, if they could have, killed them all. As the end of the Second World War came around, there were many guards who fled and tried to make a run for it. In total, the amount who were ever brought to justice and a courtroom was minimal, and many managed to get away and lived out the rest of their lives very quietly, looking over their shoulders. But in the immediate aftermath of the liberation, large amounts of prisoners would turn their anger upon the prisoner functionaries known as the capos and guards who they managed to capture. Inside of Dachau, a prisoner stated that after the camp's liberation, prisoners swarmed over the wire and grabbed the Americans and lifted them to their shoulders. Other prisoners caught the SS men. The first SS man elbowed one or two prisoners out of his way, but the courage of the inmates mounted. They knocked them down, and nobody could see whether they were stomped or what, but they were killed. Also around Dachau, SS men, capos and informants were beaten badly with weapons and also fists. Inmates took shovels, sticks and whatever they could find to those who had terrorised them, and there were a few incidents in which the American soldiers looked away as prisoners beat German guards to death. 2 prisoners battered one with a shovel, and the Liberators left this to happen, and one American Lieutenant William Walsh witnessed this. Another soldier saw an inmate stomping on an SS soldier's face until there was allegedly, and I quote, not much left. When the soldier said to him, "You have a lot of hate in your heart," the prisoner nodded. A US priest was also informed by 3 prisoners who had left the camp during the liberation that they had beat to death one of the most sadistic SS guards who they found hiding inside of a barn nearby, dressed as a local peasant. The American authorities let this happen, and they did so as they were horrified by what they found themselves. The US also carried out reprisals at Dachau, and they shot a number of guards inside of an enclosure as a machine gun was turned on them by a soldier who thought the guards were trying to escape. There were other incidents in which the Americans shot a number of former guards themselves. One group who was targeted was capos, prisoner functionaries. These were initially prisoners inside of the camps who were assigned by the SS guards to supervise forced labour and to carry out different duties, and they were involved in the punishment of other inmates. As the camps were liberated, many capos were subjected to reprisals. Some were lynched around the camps by the prisoners, and others were beaten and battered to death. Inside of Bergen-Belsen, it was claimed that prisoners, after liberation, attacked the capos and they lynched and killed roughly 170 of them, with this being seen as the most disgraceful role someone could commit inside of the camp, except for being a guard. They were seen as traitors amongst the prisoner population. Also within Belsen, there was a lot of anger and riots broke out. The angry and suffering inmates ran riots throughout the camp, and they targeted many people who had imprisoned them. On the 17th of April 1945, inside of Camp 2, 7 carpos were found, and the inmates approached them and beat them to death, leaving their corpses in the dirt. There had also earlier been 7 more carpos who were captured that evening, and they were themselves executed, being beaten to death, and their bodies were then displayed being lynched. Erdorf concentration camp was liberated on the 4th of April 1945, and one US private who was there claimed, and I quote, "We drove in, and between the gate and barracks were 30 dead, the blood still wet from departing German guards." There were bodies piled up inside of the sheds, and many of these were partially burned. Another liberator claimed, "We walked into a shed, and the bodies were piled up like wood, and there are no words to describe it." Patton recounted in his diary that, in a shed was a pile of around 40 completely naked human bodies, in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purpose of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be about 200, the bodies were taken to a pit a mile from the camp where they were buried. The inmates claimed that 3,000 men who had either been shot in the head or had died of starvation had been so buried since the 1st of January. But the prisoners of Erdorf went looking for SS guards who remained. 2 SS guards who were wearing civilian clothes were located, and they were then battered by the former inmates. They were photographed having bruised and purple faces which were heavily blooded. One of these men had a huge lump on his forehead, and his head was completely purple, and the bodies were littered with bullet holes close to their hearts. On one of these guards there was at least 7 bullet holes in the man's chest. Prisoners may have found weapons belonging to the former staff, or may have been lent American weapons to do this, or the Americans may have shot at them themselves. Another SS guard of Erdorf was captured, and he was subjected to a similar end, with his clothes being torn, and he was beaten to a bloody pulp. Many of the American guards turned their back on this, and the man's body was surrounded by heavy stones, meaning that these stones would have become weapons. Another SS guard was set upon by Soviet prisoners, and their body was left in a ditch, surrounded by rocks, and one even had a swastika carved into his chest, as his body was left on the ground. Even a female guard was subjected to this sort of violence, being killed by the inmates, and she had been struck repeatedly around the face, and was finished off finally by bullet holes to the chest. This woman became one of the only female guards of the concentration camp system as a whole, who, when the camps were liberated, was immediately executed by the prisoners. Now it's obvious to consider why the prisoners slaughtered the guards. They would not have been told that there would be war crimes trials imminently, as this was not at the time planned, and the prisoners were of course incredibly angry, and they sought vengeance in numbers immediately. As mentioned at the start of this video, it is impossible to consider today what these men and women were going through, and what they had to live with every single day whilst they were held inside of many camps. They had no knowledge that one day some people would be brought to justice inside of a courtroom, and for many they didn't see this as enough, and they wanted to carry out some immediate justice of their own upon those people who had terrorised them for so long. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.